Welcome, everybody. It is my great pleasure to be able to introduce another of these social contract research seminar meetings, not least because we've got the particular privilege and honour this evening, Australian time, of being able to hear from someone whose work I very deeply admire and from whom I've learnt a great deal. And so it is my joy and my honour to be able to present our speaker for this evening. Jessica Whyte is the Scientia Fellow and Associate Professor in the School of Humanities and Languages and the School of Law at the University of New South Wales. She was, until recently, an Australian Research Council DECRA Fellow. She's a political theorist whose work integrates political philosophy and intellectual history. In 2013, she published Catastrophe and Redemption, the Political Thought of Giorgio Agamben. And in 2019, she published a book on which I have taken, I think, the most notes that I have taken on any book that I've read in the last few years, which is The Morals of the Market, Human Rights and the Rise of Neoliberalism, which if you haven't read, I can very warmly recommend to everybody here. As a Scientia Fellow, Jess is building on the DECRA research in a new project entitled The Moral Economy of Civilian Protection and the Transformation of International Humanitarian Law. Now, since the advertised title, Jess's paper has evolved somewhat, and rather than getting the larva of neoliberalism as gardening, we're getting the full-blown butterfly this evening. And the new title is Freedom and the Inevitability of the Market, on consumers' sovereignty. So please join me in welcoming Jessica Whyte.
Thank you very much, Chris. It's really lovely to be here. Thank you for the invitation. I'm speaking here from Sydney, from the unceded land of the Wongal people of the Eora Nations. I'm really pleased to see people from various different places here tonight. Just to say that this is very, very much a work in progress. It's something that I'm going to read, but it's something that I'm still working on. And so I hope that the reading doesn't make it sound like it's more finished than it actually is. I'm really hopeful that we'll have a conversation that I can use as I continue to work on this area. Okay, so to begin. Back in 2007, the former head of the US Federal Reserve, Alan Greenspan, was asked who he would vote for in the upcoming US presidential election. Greenspan responded that it made little difference who the next president was. The world, he said, is governed by market forces. Now, we've all become used to the personification of markets, which react with fear, trepidation, and enthusiasm to the social and economic events of the day. But there was more at stake in Greenspan's response than simply a metaphorical use of political language to describe the market. To the man who was once the world's most powerful banker, it was self-evident that political choices were now utterly constrained by a superior force that exercised a form of global governance to which all nations must conform. Now, it's become a commonplace that after decades of neoliberal restructuring, politics has been hollowed out and political decisions have been replaced by market choices. Large areas of social life, from the family to the university to government itself, have been subjected to market logics, and market languages of cost, benefit, investment, and efficiency have increasingly displaced political languages. The problem is not just the rise of economics as a so-called master discipline. For neoliberal thinkers, the market is much more than an economic mechanism for the efficient allocation of goods and services. Nor is it simply, in the definition provided by the Oxford Dictionary of Economics, a place or institution in which buyers and sellers of a good or asset meet. Rather, markets are the institutions that bind individuals into societies and allow us to coordinate our actions with others. In this sense, neoliberal markets take on many of the qualities commonly associated with the political process. Yet, unlike politics, which neoliberal thinkers characterize as marked by coercion and violent conflicts between friends and enemies, markets are conceived by these thinkers as mechanisms for enabling harmonious, mutually beneficial social relations between free and equal individuals. In this paper, I want to consider a key example of the displacement of political languages by market languages, the reconfiguring of the market as a superior mechanism of democratic participation and decision-making. As early as 1905, the Austrian school economist Frank A. Fetter declared the market is a democracy where every penny gives a right to vote. Fetter's point was that the consequences of each purchase extended far beyond the individual consumer. Individual consumer choices also directed industry as a whole. The consumer, Fetter wrote, decides to buy a book and more type and paper are made and more printers are employed. He subscribes to foreign missions and Christian workers penetrate further into Africa. It's a revealing example. Fetter's analogy, which construed consumption as a form of voting, as akin to voting, became a staple of neoliberal discourse in the century that followed, and one that united the diverse strands of the neoliberal movement. Writing in 1947, the German autoliberal Franz Böhm described the formation of market prices as a voting process, and the free market economy as, in his words, the perfect expression of mass democracy. His colleague Wilhelm Röpke took the position further, re-signifying Ernest Renan's definition of a nation. Röpke described the market economy as a plébiscite tous les jours, a daily plebiscite, where every monetary unit spent by the consumer represents a ballot. In this ballot, Röpke continued, the producers are endeavouring, by their advertising, to give election publicity to an infinite number of parties, that is, goods. The Chicago economist Milton Friedman similarly argued that on the market, in his words, each man can take a vote, as it were, for the colour of tie that he wants and get it, without having to submit to the preferences of the majority. So as this makes clear, neoliberals did not confine themselves to conceiving the market as a democratic mechanism that was like the ballot box. For the Austrian school economist Ludwig von Mises, who made the sovereignty of the consumers central to his attack on economic planning, it was necessary to stress that the market was superior to the ballot. It's not enough to simply declare the market a democracy in which every penny gives a right to cast a ballot, Mises wrote in Human Action. In a political democracy, decisions are made by a majority, while the minority is left without influence. But on the market, he wrote, no vote is cast in vain. Röpke also argued that the advantage of the democracy of consumers lay in its perfectly proportional system of voting. For Milton Friedman, again, writing with his wife, Rose Director Friedman, while majority rule is a necessary expedient, it's very different from the kind of freedom you have when you shop at a supermarket. That's a quote. It was in the latter sphere, the Friedmans contended, that the individual is really free to choose. The ballot box produces conformity without unanimity. The marketplace, unanimity without conformity, they wrote. The former, the ballot, should therefore only be used to make those few decisions in which conformity is truly essential. The metaphor between the market and the ballot was particularly important to Virginia School neoliberals, who developed it into a full-blown theory of public choice. Although the key Virginia School figure, James Buchanan, rejected any straightforward analogy between a dollar and a vote, he did so in order to advocate the superiority of the market process in minimizing coercion and realizing individual freedom and choice. So for all of these thinkers, the market was not only economically preferable in enabling the most efficient allocation of goods and services, it was preferable on political grounds as well. The market, they suggested, is more responsive than political democracy to the choices of minorities. And unlike the political process, it does not rely on coercion to subject the minority to the majority will. Although they somewhat grudgingly acknowledged the highly unequal distribution of so-called ballots in the market, they tended to minimize the consequences of this inequality. For Ludwig von Mises, for instance, this unequal distribution was itself the result of a previous round of consumer voting and was therefore itself democratic. In any case, the advantages of the market economy far exceeded any disadvantages caused by the unequal distribution of voting power. In allowing each individual to pursue her own preferences, the neoliberals argued, the market fosters peaceful social interactions and dispenses with the need for bloody conflicts over ultimate ends. And of course, this meant that the individual market participant is more free than the individual citizen. While the citizen must be prepared to submit to the decision of the majority, the consumer always retains her freedom of choice. The consequence then of this valorization of the market was that fewer decisions should be made by the political process and more should be made by individual consumers on the market. Market choices should replace political deliberation and decision-making, and the consumer, not the citizen, should exercise sovereignty. So in the remainder of this paper, I want to critically examine this idea that the consumers are sovereign by turning to the work of a figure who developed the first elaborated theory of what he called consumers' sovereignty, the British economist William H. Hutt. Hutt was a British economist who was trained at the London School of Economics, where he was strongly influenced by Friedrich Hayek, amongst others. And he spent much of his life as a professor of economics at the University of Cape Town in South Africa. His first academic paper, published in 1926, argued that the factory system had been beneficial to the poor, and his first book, published in 1930, has been described as a frontal attack on the economic role of trade unions. So Hutt, it's fair to say, was no man of the left. Indeed, he was soon identified as a fellow traveller by the early neoliberal movement. Although he did not attend the 1938 Walter Lippmann colloquium, dubbed the birth of neoliberalism, the colloquium's chair, Louis Rougier, soon wrote to him, "We count you as one of us." Hutt also missed the inaugural meeting of Hayek's Mont Pelerin Society, founded in 1947 to revive international liberalism. But he joined the society the next year and then became a regular fixture at its biennial meetings. Hutt was therefore an important, if a relatively neglected figure in the emergence of neoliberalism. And I want to suggest that his influence is most clearly felt in his efforts to systemize the concept of consumers' sovereignty. Hutt developed this idea of consumers' sovereignty, and I need to say here, because this is a spoken paper, that the apostrophe comes after the final S. And this is something that's often misrendered when people talk about Hutt's theory. It was the consumers in the plural who were sovereign, not the individual's consumer. And I think that's important. So he developed this idea in his 1936 book, Economists and the Public. His definition there made clear that his intent was to wrestle power back from the political realm to the marketplace. The consumer is sovereign, Hutt wrote, when, in his role as citizen, he has not delegated to political institutions for authoritarian use the power which he can exercise socially through his power to demand or to refrain from demanding. So it's clear, I think, from this definition that Hutt's questions were not narrow ones about efficiency and allocation. Rather, he introduced the concept of consumers' sovereignty in an attempt to answer two key questions. How can power be made acceptable to those who are ruled? And how can individual freedom be secured within a social order? These concerns, of course, bring Hutt's work into relation with the social contract tradition and behove us to examine it in light of questions posed within that tradition and not simply narrow economic questions. What kind of sovereignty is consumers' sovereignty? What, if anything, makes it legitimate? Who, if anyone, exercises it? Is it personal or impersonal, individual or collective? How does the process of will formation operate? How is this sovereignty exercised? How is its force made operative? And what rights, if any, do individuals have against the sovereign? Now, I'll touch on many of these questions, but my key concern here is to critically examine Hutt's argument that consumers' sovereignty is the best means to secure individual freedom. Hutt identified liberty as the supreme principle underpinning his account of consumers' sovereignty. He was so convinced of the freedom-enhancing spirit of his proposals that he threw down a gauntlet to critics. The only grounds on which the consumer's sovereignty ideal may be attacked, he asserted, is by a refutation of our conception of liberty. Taking up this challenge, I'm going to argue in this paper that Hutt's valorization of the market was a means, in fact, to instill both individual and collective unfreedom. Hutt's real concern was not so much with freedom, I will suggest, as with preventing social discontent and enabling social pacification. Restrictions on freedom were problematic to him only to the extent that they were resented. His concern was less with the question of how power was made legitimate than it was with how it came to appear inevitable. I want to suggest these are not the same thing. People who were confronted with a force they believed to be inevitable, he thought, would not resist it any more than they would resist the wind or the rain. Hutt's wager was that the sovereignty of the consumer should be imbued with all the inevitability of a natural process. Only then would individuals and collectives simply submit to its dictates. Ultimately then, for Hutt, it was not individuals, either individually or collectively, who were sovereign. In fact, what was sovereign was the market itself. For Hutt, market forces not only governed the world, as Alan Greenspan had put it, market forces were sovereign as well. So why sovereignty? Hutt turned to the problem of sovereignty in the course of a discussion of the relationship between freedom and restraint. Like the neoliberal movement more broadly, Hutt rejected the naturalism that underpinned much laissez-faire philosophy, and he conceived human freedom as the result of an appropriate institutional order. Hutt's discussions of natural freedom evoked a Hobbesian state of nature, a literal free-for-all in which one individual's freedom would restrain that of another. Hutt similarly criticised the idea that there is a natural social order, an idea he claimed was upheld only by those with a poor grasp of economic science. Rejecting the naive physiocratic belief in a law of nature that would allow individuals to pursue their own goods, in his words, under the sole condition of not annoying others, Hutt stressed that freedom in society relied on restraints. His work was thus oriented to identifying the form of restraint that would be most conducive to individual freedom. Not only this problematic, but Hutt's solution to it appear at first to be Republican ones. Restraints will be least problematic for freedom, he contended, when they are felt to be impersonal and impartial, when no one is subjected to the arbitrary will of another, and no one is singled out for discriminatory treatment. Yet Hutt's version of the institution that would achieve such restraint was not the rule of law. Rather, he focused his attention on a form of what he called control over persons that results from the combined actions of all the other individuals in society. That is, in an impersonal social will, in his words, expressed through the price, wage, and interest system. Now, in referring to consumers' sovereignty, Hutt was aware that he was introducing into economics a language more usually located in the political sphere, and one that he wrote has always involved great difficulties. Hutt's definition of consumers' sovereignty suggested that power originates with individuals who are both consumers and citizens, and who may either exercise their power directly in the market or delegate it to political authorities. In designating the consumers as sovereign, Hutt meant to suggest much more than the simple claim that each individual controls her own consumer choices and may spend her money to buy the product she most desires. Consumer sovereignty was primarily a description of the organisation of production and a normative position that could be used to assess that organisation. Through their individual acts of consumer choice, Hutt suggested, consumers dictate to those who own the means of production. They command them to produce those things that they desire, and they thereby control the use that society makes of its resources. He therefore explicitly affirmed the idea of sovereignty as a unitary power to command and to compel obedience. Hutt made clear that his concern was with ultimate power, not with the source of authority. The sovereign, according to his definition, was the body of persons in whom the actual power ultimately resides. Carl Schmitt infamously criticised such abstract definitions of sovereignty, arguing that the true locus of sovereignty was only revealed in the concrete circumstances in which it was necessary to declare an exception. In seeking to relocate ultimate power from the political state to the market, Hutt portrayed sovereignty as a result not of one sovereign decision, but of the individual choices of a multitude of consumers. The state, in Hutt's capitalised form, is society's political manifestation, he wrote. In its democratic form, its role is to effectuate the will of the aggregate of citizens as electors. Yet he insisted that the state did not play the most important role in what he wrote was the social control which maximises liberty and justice. So for him, liberty and justice were best fostered when sovereignty was located not in the state, but in society, where the aggregated choices of individual consumers produced, he suggested, a single sovereign will. This will was central to Hutt's normative case for consumers' sovereignty. Although economic theory is not itself normative, he argued, the political economist is consistently called upon to arbitrate conflicts of interest and so must have recourse to an idea of the general good. He contended that the judgments of political economists that certain actions are beneficial or injurious rest on philosophical presuppositions, on certain conceptions concerning the natural right of men to live and enjoy the good things of life. That's a quote. Given this, Hutt argued that economists can't do without a conception of the ultimate good. Indeed, he wrote, any state resting upon consent also requires such an ideal. Consumers' sovereignty was Hutt's ideal, his answer to the question of the common good. A society in which the consumers are sovereign is one that can best fulfill the material and non-material needs of its subjects, he suggested, and so, in his words, can make universal acquiescence in its standards, although not universal acceptance of its intrinsic ethical or aesthetic goodness, and not unreasonable hope. I might just read that quote again because I mangled it a bit and it's a bit complex. So he argued that a society in which consumers are sovereign can make universal acquiescence in its standards, although not universal acceptance of its intrinsic ethical or aesthetic goodness, and not unreasonable hope. So Hutt introduced consumers' sovereignty as a means to answer a political question. How is it possible to found a state on consent, or at least on acquiescence? The concept of consumers' sovereignty was a challenge to critics of capitalism who argued that the capitalists or entrepreneurs ruled over society as a whole. If the consumers are sovereigns, then the capitalists were at most mere trustees who held on to property in the interests of the consumers and were bound to follow their commands. The Austrian school economist Ludwig von Mises brought out the polemical stake of this more clearly than did Hutt. In a section of his magnum opus Human Action with the title The Metaphorical Employment of the Terminology of Political Rule, Mises criticised those who applied terminology taken from politics or military strategy to business. He insisted that when successful capitalists or entrepreneurs are referred to as kings or dukes, and their enterprises are called empires or kingdoms, this is not just a harmless metaphor. Such terminology is used to delegitimize business by associating it with force, compulsion, and illegitimate power. Government is an apparatus of compulsion and coercion, Mises wrote. It has the power to compel obedience by force. And the political sovereign, whether autocratic or popular, wields an ideological might that gives it the power to crush rebellions. None of this, he contended, is true of the capitalist. Far from ruling his customers, he serves them. Rather than exercising political power, he is subjected to laws that often deprive him of his power. So it's noteworthy that saying all this about this metaphorical employment of the language of political rule, Mises also then declares the sovereign to be the consumers. Hutt's own concern in a context of rising collectivism and state intervention was to delegitimize both trade union organizing and state intervention in the economy. Any interference with the market, whether by means of collective wage agreements, state labour standards, or price controls, would usurp the sovereignty of consumers at large and exercise it in the name of privileged groups, he suggested. The consumers are indifferent to the status of producers, he argues, and so competition is privilege dissolving, in his words. Hutt's central concern was to uphold the general will of the consumers against what he framed as the particular interests of privileged groups, notably trade unions. Consumers' sovereignty, in Hutt's Rousseauian terms, was the form in which the general will imposed itself on particular interests. He compared consumers' sovereignty to what he called the absolutism of the state, which is justified by the fact that each citizen has at least a small share in government. And he spoke in this context of the supremacy of the general will, at whose behest he is forced into obedience. That's a quote. Just as for Rousseau, each individual is split, both a citizen and a subject, for Hutt, each individual is not only a producer, but also a consumer, not only subject, but sovereign, in his words. As a consumer, the individual is sovereign, Hutt wrote. As a producer, he is subject. In the latter guise, the producer, one must obey without question. For Hutt, as for Rousseau, there was no place for individual rights vis-a-vis the sovereign. The claim that all individuals as consumers comprised the sovereign social will eradicated any need for limitations on this sovereignty. Indeed, far from seeking to limit the power of consumers' sovereignty through checks and balances, regulation, or counterpowers, trade unions for instance, Hutt sought to empower this social will to the greatest extent vis-a-vis the state. State activities are only one form in which the social will is expressed, he contended. And he wrote, the social will may be most truly sovereign under the system which vests the greatest measure of sovereignty or ultimate power in the consumer. Where Hutt departed dramatically from Rousseau, and indeed from the social contract tradition at large, was in portraying a sovereign will that was not the product of a voluntary contract. There was no suggestion in Hutt's work that individuals, even as an abstraction, of course, voluntarily contracted with each other for the purpose of establishing a sovereign. There was no explicit commitment to the general good, no sense of participating in something bigger than oneself, no cultivation of virtue. Unlike the political sovereign, the sovereignty of the consumers was more akin to Adam Smith's infamous invisible hand, which results from the numerous unconscious, self-interested individual actions. This means that for all his talk of sovereignty, individual consumers not only lacked the ability to consciously shape social priorities, they were unaware of even contributing to such priorities. Hutt's act of secular faith consisted in affirming that the general good emerges when each individual pursues her own interests on the market. So to the democracy of the consumers. Hutt, like the neoliberals who followed him, praised consumer choice in the market as a superior mechanism of democratic will formation. Regarded as an ideal, Hutt wrote, consumers' sovereignty rests on the same assumption as does the ideal of representative government. Hutt was not content to stress that consumers' sovereignty shared the principles of democracy. His key concern was to highlight its superiority to political democracy. But then Hutt's own support for political democracy was lukewarm at best. The inevitability of representative government could not be taken for granted, he contended, and neither can its desirability be uncritically accepted. While he conceded that at that time, democracy was, in his words, the only method of enabling a change of government without shooting, he argued that representative government rested on a false assumption, in his words, the political rationality of human beings. Under the conditions of popular enfranchisement, political success is not a result of an appeal to the reason of the electorate. Instead, those wishing to succeed in politics appealed to emotions and prejudices, seeking to exploit what Hutt called the herd instinct or the mob frenzy of the voters. Rather than offering a reasoned defence of the common good, politicians, on Hutt's account, seek to buy off interest groups by promising them special privileges. Thus, while he argued that consumers' sovereignty would have at least as much social validity as a decision at the ballot box on the assumption of similar rationality on the part of voters in an election and consumers in a marketplace, he said that this fundamental assumption could not be sustained. We know, of course, he wrote, that consumers on the marketplace are incomparably more rational and less seriously misled by propaganda than voters under representative government. Hutt was, however, a cultural snob and was not indifferent to what he called the deficiencies of consumer rationality. He did not rely on a perfectly rational subject of the kind presupposed by neoclassical theories of competition. But in asserting the superior rationality of consumers, he sought to counter those critics of the market who argued that consumers were manipulated by advertising and driven by whims and emotions. The Virginia School public choice theorist James Buchanan, who was influenced by Hutt, provided a much more detailed account of why market choice is more rational than voting. The consumer, Buchanan argued, is both more certain about the effects of his choice than the voter, at least at the primary level, which Buchanan suggests is all that motivates the actions of the individual consumer, and the consumer is more responsible for the choice. While the consumer is uniquely responsible for her choice of product and sure of receiving it in exchange for her money, the voter never knows in advance what the results of an election will be, and she can always let others decide on her behalf. Market choices are also more divisible than votes. The consumer can split her dollars. This is all Buchanan, by the way, that I'm paraphrasing here. Can split her dollars and buy numerous different commodities, while the voter has only one vote, which means, in Buchanan's words, that market choices are finer and more articulate than votes. Yet while Buchanan contended that market choice expresses more rational individual behaviour, he acknowledged that this did not mean it produced greater social rationality. But what at first sight appeared to be an argument in favour of voting, that it gives individuals a greater sense of participation in social decision-making and may therefore make them more likely to consider the public interest, soon turned into an argument against voting. Voting will produce consistent or rational social choice, Buchanan wrote, only if men, and they're always men, are able to agree on the ultimate social goals, he contended. But if they can't agree, and Buchanan assumed they could not, attempting to develop a social choice through voting would only lead to coercion of minorities. We've seen then that it is from the perspective of individual freedom that Hutt ultimately defended the market over the ballot box as a superior democratic institution. Such democratic control through the market, he wrote, is desirable as it fosters the tolerance of individual preferences and gives individuals control over their own lives. So in the following section, I want to turn to Hutt's argument that consumers' sovereignty enhances liberty. And I want to argue that what Hutt calls liberty is in fact a form of resignation or submission in the face of the seeming inevitability of market forces. From the perspective of freedom as non-interference, market forces can't be coercive. In a critical response to Hutt, the Austrian school libertarian Murray Rothbard argued that the language of consumer sovereignty obscured the difference between coercive political relations and the freedom of the market. Sovereignty is the quality of ultimate political power, Rothbard wrote. It is the power resting on the use of violence. From Rothbard's libertarian perspective, the power of consumers was of a completely different kind. The consumers lacked the power to coerce producers into particular occupations, he argued, and the dependence of the producer on the consumer is purely voluntary, a product of individual choice. Instead of referring to consumers' sovereignty, Rothbard suggested, the free market should be conceived as a site of individual self-sovereignty, in his words, where the individual retains sovereignty over his own persons and actions and over his own property, and is entirely free to choose whether and to what extent to engage in economic transactions. Many critics of liberalism, Marxist and otherwise, have pointed out that this idealized image of market freedom obscures the very real consequences for those who choose not to satisfy the demands of the market. It is to Rothbard's credit that he was explicit about the consequences of such freedom, even if he attempted to naturalize them. It is a reflection on nature, not on the free market, he wrote, that everyone is free to starve. From Rothbard's liberal perspective, we are free to the extent that we are, in his words, unmolested by other persons, even if we have no other option but to starve. Hutt himself is quite willing to describe consumers' sovereignty as coercive, unlike Rothbard. Indeed, he called it the most important source of social coercion. And this is something that has been missed by many people who have written on Hutt's work, such as there is a scholarship who tend to assume that this consumer's sovereignty can't be coercive. Yet Hutt was quite explicit that it was, but he argued that this social coercion fulfills three key conditions that make it compatible with human freedom. It is impartial, impersonal, and inevitable. Now, in outlining these conditions, Hutt proceeded by analogy with law. People will consider legal restraints to be impartial, he suggested, if they're seen to be made by people whose interests coincide with the general interest. This again is a fairly standard Republican view. As Philip Pettit notes, from a Republican perspective, interference or constraint need not be considered dominating if the agent that interferes is constrained to do so in a way that accounts for and tracks the interests of those affected. Also fairly uncontroversial was Hutt's contention that for a law to fulfill this condition, it should be general and must not single out a group or individual or seek to benefit some at the expense of others. Laws that seem to an agent to be impartial in this sense, he wrote, will also seem to him to be impersonal. Here, Hutt contrasts how an agent views a bylaw which prescribes the closing time of a public park with how the same agent views the act of an individual landowner who curtails a right of way. The first will be tolerated because it is impersonal, while the second is likely to produce resentment as it involves the direct imposition of the landowner's will. Now here as elsewhere, and I'll return to this point, Hutt's concern is less with the nature of the restraints themselves than with how they're likely to be conceived by the individual. That is, whether the restraints will be accepted or will produce resentment or resistance. Where Hutt diverged from the Republican defense of rule by law, not by men, is in his argument that individual freedom requires not only legal restraints, but also what he terms social restraints. The options of any one individual in society are restrained by the exercise of economic power on the part of others, he argued, and the individual economic agent operates in a constraining environment that results from the actions of numerous others who know little of his existence. This form of social coercion, he argued, is rarely recognised as even existing. Hutt sought to bring it to light and to subject it to the same scrutiny to which Republicans traditionally subject laws. Like the more familiar legal restraints, Hutt wrote, social restraints must also be impartial and impersonal in order to be acceptable. So this social restraint, the restraint exercised by consumer sovereignty, is impartial, Hutt argued, because it is blind to particular interests. Unlike state intervention, which he argued can bestow privileges on some at the expense of others, under the conditions of consumer sovereignty, all are subjected to the impartial force of competition, all must compete on the same terms, and all will be judged and perhaps found wanting according to the same consumer standards. Here, Hutt inserted an interesting stipulation. Social coercions will be shown to be impartial, he wrote, when there is effective equality of opportunity. Hutt was far more tolerant of state action to achieve such equality of opportunity than was usual in the neoliberal milieu. To this end, he countenanced limits on inheritance, state subsidies for education, and a level of progressive taxation for the purpose of redistributing wealth. Much of this would be dispensed with by his followers. Yet Hutt's commitment to equality of opportunity shouldn't be overstated, and it often is. Even as he contended that only equality of opportunity would render consumers' sovereignty impartial, he also argued that it may be beneficial to regard as inevitable certain inequalities that can only be ameliorated gradually, or in his words, in a more rational community. The benefit on this account is that inequalities that are felt to be inevitable are unlikely to provoke social conflict. Hence, he wrote, as inequalities may be thought of as inevitable in this sense, their existence does not prevent us from considering market forces as impartial and impersonal representations of social restraints. Now, to concretize this a little, while I don't have space to consider this in detail here, this position informed Hutt's response to apartheid. As I mentioned, he spent much of his career at the University of Cape Town, and his admirers often portray him as a harsh critic of apartheid, which he depicted as a response, as a product of the attempt of trade unions to preserve the privileges of white workers. His solution, however, hardly warranted such celebratory accounts, in my view. Although he advocated the removal of racial discrimination in employment, he stressed the need for gradual change and was preoccupied by deep anxieties about a Black political majority. In Economists and the Public, he had warned, in more general terms, that, in his words, however desirable or even imperative equality may be as a long-run ideal, its rapid and unanticipated introduction would bring great suffering to the innocently privileged classes. In South Africa, he sought to protect these innocently privileged classes by translating the premises of consumer sovereignty into the sphere of electoral politics. Hutt's proposal was for a weighted franchise in which votes, like the dollars that underpinned them, would be unequally distributed on the basis of property, to the obvious benefit of the white minority. Such a solution, Hutt believed, would enable a gradual shift towards greater equality and ward off the dangers of what he called Black supremacy. At some time in the distant future, Hutt wrote, adding it would be very optimistic to assume 50 years, when the aggregate number of non-European voters equaled that of the Europeans, the value of each non-European vote would begin gradually and very slowly to diminish. So much for impartiality and its reliance on equality of opportunity. As we've seen, Hutt also argued that if they were not to be resented, restraints must be impersonal. The idea that market forces liberate individuals from dependence on personal power goes back at least to Adam Smith, who noted that in contrast to feudal retainers who were completely dependent on their lords, tradesmen derived their subsistence from 100 or 1,000 different customers. While the workman is in some means obliged to them all, Smith argued, as each customer supplies only 1,000th part of his annual maintenance, therefore he is not absolutely dependent on any one of them. Smith was clear, however, that in a different context, this reliance on one's customers could still be felt to be an unacceptable dependence. In the settler colonial context of North America, where uncultivated land, in his words, is plentiful, he noted that the average colonist preferred to plant his own land than to manufacture commodities for distant commerce, as he believed, in Smith's words, that an artificer is the servant of his customers from whom he derives his subsistence, while a planter who relies on his own land and the labour of his family is really a master and independent of all the world. The impersonality that Hutt affirmed went further than did Smith's example, however. It was not just that any individual manufacturer was restrained by or dependent on his own customers. All of us are restrained by the actions of an anonymous mass of other consumers, which find their expressions in the laws of supply and demand. Restraining forces whose origin is hidden in this way are seldom regarded in the light of restrictions on freedom, even by the rational and critical citizen, he wrote, for they are impersonal. Hutt saw the acceptance that our lives are ruled by impersonal social forces as a sign of social maturity. He turned to Herbert Spencer, for whom the belief that the economic system was controlled for personal ends was as immature as the belief that personal agencies were at work in the physical universe. In the former case, Spencer argued, constancy of sequence had gradually established a belief in the law of supply and demand, as some thousands of years ago it established a belief in the law of gravitation. Hutt criticised Spencer, however, for viewing the law of supply and demand as a natural, indestructible force, and so neglecting the need for appropriate institutions. The laws that bear on us in the market are not natural laws, Hutt argued, but sociological forces that, in his words, work in unseen ways and are expressed unobtrusively through the price mechanism. It was in the unseen and unobtrusive nature of this impersonal power that Hutt saw the condition of freedom. While market forces constrain our options, there is no individual or group of individuals who we can identify as responsible for such constraint. Borrowing from the North American sociologist C.H. Cooley, Hutt contended that while we may bemoan the loss of our trade, there is seldom one person who can be fixed upon as the cause. In a defence of the value of competitive markets for Republicans, Robert S. Taylor argues that this impersonality protects us from arbitrary interference, As market prices are set by the impersonal forces of supply and demand, he argues, individuals cannot interfere at will to set discretionary price. The price, so to speak, of this liberation from personal dependence, however, is the renaturalization of the market. Noting that the source of the coercion that we experience in a market economy is hidden from us, Hutt approvingly cites Cooley's remark that most people look upon the social conditions under which they work very much as the farmer looks upon the weather and other natural agents. This renaturalization ultimately serves the purposes of social pacification. Workers who see themselves as dependent on a group of capitalists may resent their wage slavery, but they will not resent the impersonal system to which they are subjected, Hutt suggested. As Persky, a scholar, glosses this point, workers who think their pay cut or job loss originates in impersonal market forces are likely to be far less disruptive than those who interpret their misfortune as the fault of a commissar or even a president. For Persky, who was writing as a market socialist in the wake of the fall of the Berlin Wall and the reintroduction of capitalist market relations to Eastern Europe, Hutt's real contribution was to conceptualize conditions under which labour discipline became legitimate. And yet I would suggest that Hutt's real concern was not so much with legitimacy as it was with the absence of social conflict. Now, we can debate whether those are the same thing. Persky rightly identifies that for all his talk of the supremacy of liberty, it was social pacification that was really the key value underpinning Hutt's account of consumer sovereignty. Such pacification required the disciplining of labour, and in Persky's account, it was Hutt's emphasis on the impersonality of consumer power as expressed through markets that simultaneously resigned and disciplined labour to its social role. Okay, so to conclude, I want to turn to Hutt's final condition for the acceptability of social restraints, inevitability. To be resigned to power is not, I wish to suggest, necessarily to view that power as legitimate, nor is it to be free, much less to be sovereign. Although Hutt begins his discussion of restraints with the question of what attributes of restraint make for liberty, he quickly shifts from this question to a different one. In his words, what kind of restraints are in fact resented? As Hutt is aware, it's not obvious that the absence of a feeling of being restrained is evidence that an individual is not in fact restrained. The slave under a kind master, he writes, will accept without question the regime in which he finds himself. The restrictions around him will be regarded with the same indifference as if they were facts of nature. Now, the figure of the slave with a kind master is, of course, a staple of discussions about liberal and republican conceptions of freedom. If freedom means non-interference, as liberals suggests, then if this kind master refrains from exercising his power to interfere and allows his slave to act in accordance with his own will, it is possible to consider this slave as free. From a Republican perspective, in contrast, to be unfree is to be subjected to the power and jurisdiction of another. Even if slaves are, as a matter of fact, able to act at will, they remain, as Quinton Skinner reminds us, within the power of their masters, and so cannot be considered free. What matters for Republicans is not whether or not the master exercises this power to interfere, nor whether or not the master is kind, but the very fact that the master has the capacity to interfere at will. For Hutt, the relevant distinction is elsewhere. What matters is not whether the slave is actually interfered with or whether he is subjected to another's will. Rather, the key question is whether he resents his situation, and this in turn depends on whether or not he regards it as inevitable. The condition of the slave matters because Hutt refers to individuals at large as slaves to society. Although he affirmed liberty as the supreme value, his own terminology was often borrowed from the registers of enslavement and servitude. The individual is in a sense the slave of society, he wrote, but it is in his enslavement to a society in which the expression of individual wills is impartial that the liberty of the individual in any rational sense alone can be realised, he wrote. It's clear that what concerned Hutt was not so much the objective question of whether or not individuals are free, but the subjective one of whether or not they resented their restraints. The key fact determining whether we resent the restraints to which we are subjected for Hutt was whether or not we were convinced of their inevitability. In the case of the slave, the fact that his options are so constrained and enslavement so naturalized that he regards it with indifference does not alter the fact that he is in a structural relation of domination, though it may well make the slave unlikely to rebel. More broadly, Hutt argues that we resent restraints only, in his words, when we recognise that there is a preferred and realisable alternative to the existing state of affairs. So this is really important. We only resent restraints, not only when we don't see them as inevitable, but when we see that there's actually a genuine, realisable alternative. If, on the other hand, we are convinced that there is no alternative, we are likely to submit to our situation, treating its laws as akin to the laws of nature. Consumers' sovereignty appears to be inevitable in precisely this way. While it bears upon the individual and shapes her options in life, she rarely considers herself controlled by it. Or in Hutt's words, he is no more led to think about it as a rule than is primitive man to wonder about the force of gravity. So Hutt and the neoliberal thinkers who mobilised the concept of consumer sovereignty in his wake were concerned, I would suggest, not so much with freedom as with renaturalising the market. This helps us to understand a seeming paradox of the rise of neoliberalism. While neoliberal thinkers fought many of their battles against socialism, social democracy, and economic planning on the terrain of freedom, they found their slogan in Margaret Thatcher's frank assertion, "There is no alternative." The hegemony of neoliberalism was secure when this belief was taken up as a matter of popular common sense, not only on the right, but also on the social democratic supposed left. When asked about her greatest political accomplishment, Thatcher once responded, "Tony Blair." I'll therefore give the penultimate word to Blair himself. In 2005, Blair, who did so much to naturalise the market as the sole horizon of economic political life, said, "I hear people say we have to stop and debate globalisation. You might as well debate whether autumn should follow summer." Here, the impersonal coercion of market forces was transformed into a force of nature. Far from offering freedom, this transformation restrained political options and hampered political imaginaries. Rather than making us free as individuals or sovereign as collectives, it inured us all to an absence of alternatives and the inevitability of submission to our market-ordained fates. Thank you.
Wonderful, thank you.
And thank you all for being here so late as well, those of you who are here somewhere in Australia and others elsewhere.
Thank you ever so much, Jess. What a wonderful, rich paper. I've got a whole litany of questions, but I'm going to spare you in the first instance. Perhaps I can kick off the question time with one of mine, and then
sure, please.
Other people, I'm sure, will have many things to pick up on as well. You mentioned a number of times this idea of the common good and the different ways in which it's deployed in these discourses. And I've just got a couple of questions about that. First of all, do Hutt and Buchanan and people use common good language themselves? And do they think that the common good is compatible with market sovereignty? And I'm thinking, if it's an invisible hand sort of common good, can it possibly be common in the sense that it's good for all, especially, you know, those with no money to spend in a discretionary manner and therefore no vote in this sense? And if not, then what can common possibly mean? And then in your own opinion, what sort of common good can there be under the sovereignty of the market?
Thank you. That's a very good question. Hutt very explicitly used the language of common good. He said that this whole discussion of consumer sovereignty was an attempt to answer the question of how do we formulate a common good as the basis of a political power that would, or a power, sorry, that would be acceptable. In terms of how he thought that this situation made this common good possible, it was an invisible hand kind of argument. It was the argument that when each individual pursues their own interests through the market, that this will lead to the best possible outcome for all. But his concern was less with efficiency than it was with an idea that this enables every individual to pursue her own ultimate ends and to pursue what she wants without having to subordinate that to others. So in a sense, the common was the value of freedom, that everybody supposedly benefited from the most free society. Now, Hutt fudged this question of freedom to starve that Rothbard at least was willing to take up very explicitly. Hutt sort of presupposed that under this system there would ultimately be an equalisation of opportunity at least. He wasn't so interested in economic inequality, but it was important to his system. He did say that it would only be legitimate if there was equality of opportunity in terms of this sovereignty, although with the proviso, as I said, that inequalities that were considered inevitable were not problematic. He also believed that competition, as I mentioned, was an inherently privilege dissolving. So in his view, any lack of inequality of opportunity, all inequalities were the result of private groupings being given particular privileges. Now, again and again, the grouping that he singled out was the trade union movement, the obviously most privileged grouping in society at the time that he was writing. And he also believed that any existing privileges were a result of state limitations on competition, so that competition would dissolve all these privileges and you would then have a sort of utopia of equality of opportunity, and that therefore this would be the general good supreme over the good of privileged groups in particular. Now, do I think that this enables the general good? Clearly, no. I mean, I hope that it's clear. Maybe I've been too generous or too desiring to give Hutt the fairest account, but no, I don't. I think it's quite clear that, for one thing, this problem of the unequally distributed ballots is a far bigger problem than Hutt and all of those neoliberals who use this idea after him would suggest. There's a really revealing moment which I need to incorporate into this paper in Buchanan's paper about the distinction between voting and market, where he's contesting a little bit this simple analogy between the two, where he says, what the market process can't do is intervene into or change the overall power structure. So it can't actually change how many votes any individual has in a market sense. So basically what he's saying is what the market can't do is redistribute wealth and power. And I would say that the real reason that the neoliberal thinkers love the idea of consumer or market sovereignty rather than political sovereignty is precisely because the market cannot itself be used to redistribute resources from those who are more wealthy to those who have less in a society. And it's that they want to prevent. I mean, of course, they would say that redistribution happens all the time in market terms because consumers take wealth from one entrepreneur who's not doing a very good job and give it to the one they prefer. But the idea of the kind of redistribution that a political process may enable is one that is foreclosed by this option, and that's a very deliberate foreclosure on behalf of these neoliberal thinkers.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Karen, please.
So following on from that, in a sense, I wondered whether, in some sense, the people who are arguing for universal basic income are kind of taking this sort of a version, anyway, of this consumer sovereignty. I mean, after all you have to do is say something like, well, yeah, freedom is like the consumer is genuinely free, but there's this problem with the functioning of the market, that it's got this tendency to not distribute the power to be consumer power equally. Therefore, you need maybe wealth taxes, or or universal basic income, or some such, to keep on leveling it. Anyway, just a sort of a question about whether in some sense this reasoning is behind this more, if you like, left proposal as well.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And while Hutt himself, as far as I'm aware, doesn't talk about a universal basic income, both Friedrich Hayek and Milton Friedman supported versions of it. And in Friedman's case, I think it's the most revealing from this perspective, because Friedman saw it as a sort of temporary step on the way to the complete abolition of the welfare state, and to the idea of consumer choice. So in the same way that Friedman supported vouchers for schooling, and for universities for that matter, so the kinds of proposals that the Liberal government have tried to implement here time and time again and have not yet managed to do so, but where instead of the government funding universities directly, each individual prospective student would be given a voucher that they could spend at any university that they wanted, those universities being completely free to set prices in any way that they so wished, so that the voucher might give you a full degree at, say, Western Sydney University, where I used to teach until recently, but perhaps Melbourne Uni would jack up their prices so that a voucher would get you one semester of first year. So that kind of idea, which Milton Friedman was very supportive of, he saw universal basic income in a sense in line with that notion that the state would give everyone their universal basic income and then everyone could shut up. The state owed them nothing more. Don't talk to me about public funding of healthcare or education. And if you spent your own universal basic income unwisely, then that's your problem. The state gives you nothing else. So I think it's interesting. I think you're right that there's definitely a sort of a commonality in those ideas. Obviously, there are more left-wing versions of universal basic income whose proponents see themselves as attempting to free people from the pressures of wage labour, and therefore in some cases to give workers more power in a labour market because they have another alternative than to starve when they're engaged in wage negotiations or when they're searching for a job. But certainly there is that more right-wing neoliberal universal basic income strand that I think you're right fits quite nicely with this. So thanks, I hadn't made that connection.
Can I invite anyone else who has a question to Alma? Yes, thank you.
Thank you. So my question is, does Hutt mention natural selection, or does he refer to Darwinism in a way or so?
Look, I have to say that I'm early on in working on Hutt, so I can't tell you across all of his works, but he was very close to Hayek, and I've done a lot of work on Hayek, and Hayek very explicitly has an idea of social evolution. Hayek makes the argument that no sociologist needed Darwin to teach them about evolution or about natural selection because these ideas were already staples of Scottish Enlightenment sociology. So Hayek refers particularly to Adam Ferguson in this context, but Hayek has a very elaborated evolutionary account of the development of market societies whereby all forms of egalitarianism are regressions to a supposedly primordial instinct in Hayek's view, because we spent thousands of years on his account living in closed societies, small bands where we formulated quite explicitly ideas of the common good. And so interestingly for Hayek, human nature is collectivist in this sense. We always want to go back to actually sharing things and helping each other out, but we really shouldn't because it's very bad. So this has to be sort of beaten out of us by the discipline of the market. So Hayek says, man has been civilized very much against his wishes. So look, I'll have to look into whether Hutt shares that kind of evolutionary social theory. If anyone else here happens to be a Hutt expert and can tell me some more about that, I'd be really intrigued. But certainly he was very close to Hayek, and he very much saw himself as in a lineage of the classical political economists and wanting to retrieve the likes of Smith and other classical political economists from what he saw as their disrepute at the time that he was writing.
Thank you so much.
No problem.
All right. Any other questions?
I have it's sort of a question or more of a commentary or something. I don't know. Yeah, I mean, I found it very interesting the way, as you describe Hutt, like there's this rejection of the political as a sphere of demagoguery and manipulation, and then this idea that the market somehow, the consumers are less, or like display superior rationality in the market. And then, but then despite this, in a kind of hypocritical move, Hutt, whenever he talks about, as you point out, like this discussion of liberty and freedom, there's a shift away, like a displacement from objective or rational senses of freedom to the perception or like perception of freedom, like which is precisely this sphere of kind of Platonic mythologies, or the inevitability of the three metals in the Republic. Say, I was just wondering, like, is Hutt sort of, is there any awareness, like any sort of recognition on his part that what he is doing is precisely shifting this economic debate to one of like demagoguery in a way, or is this complete? Does he completely sort of ignore this, or I'm just wondering, like, how conscious is he of this move?
Yeah, look, it's very interesting. I've been trying to work this out too, and I can't entirely tell the way that he makes these comments, like, in the same passage, that this kind of restraint will only be acceptable if it's impartial. It will only be impartial if there's equality of opportunity. So we need equality of opportunity. Oh, except for the kind of inequality that we can convince ourselves is inevitable, that's fine. Like, that's quite a strange kind of move that he makes, and he makes it repeatedly every time he deals with this inevitability question. And he never really explains why inevitability should make power legitimate. Like, does the fact that a power is inevitable really mean that it's legitimate? He never quite says that. He moves very quickly from, we sense that something is inevitable, therefore it is just, and even uses the term just. So this is quite strange, and I really can't work out whether he's doing this as a kind of deliberate sleight of hand, or whether he actually can't even see what he's doing. But I think one of the things that makes me think there is a bit of deliberateness to it is just how clearly throughout all of the neoliberal thinkers and the people that he was associated with at the time, this recourse to metaphors of natural law appear again and again. The number of times that the market gets compared to the weather, and in fact that they bemoan the fact that in their own time, people no longer think of the laws of the market as being like the laws of weather, that we no longer think of market crises as natural disasters. So for them, this is a problem. For them, the market is certainly far less inevitable than it is for us today. There were very real challenges in their time. So in that sense, I feel like this idea of inevitability is really about trying to enshrine or secure a certain form of inevitability, rather than him really not noticing that he was making this move somehow.
Yes, could I just follow up on that and this idea of the market being inevitable, and circle back from that to the social contract idea. And I guess my question is revolving around the idea of what sort of social contract is a sovereign market? And I'm wondering whether it's any sort of social contract at all, for the following reason. So I'm trying to piece together different things that you said. There's this very strong thread in the paper of treating the market like a natural phenomenon. There is no alternative, in the same way that there's no alternative to nature. There's no planet B is the rhetoric. And we can just as well debate whether autumn should follow summer. Yeah. So the market is naturalized, and the way in which social relations work in the market could be thought of as some sort of sublimated war of all against all, under the framework of competition. We're all competing with each other with our dollars, And, you know, it wouldn't be hard to sort of get going some sort of Freudian reading of that as sublimated warfare. And if any of that works, then it's really got much more in common with a state of nature than it has with a social contract. And so I guess where I'm coming to with this is, shouldn't we think of the sovereign market really not as any sort of social contract, but really as a second state of nature?
Thank you. Look, that's a great question, and it's one that I've given some thought to. Schmidt makes almost exactly the same point, that the sort of Hegel's split between the state and civil society is the new form in which the Hobbesian distinction between, you know, the state or the sovereignty and the state of nature reappears. And many critics of the market, as you say, have conceived the market as a war of all against all. I think neoliberalism as a whole needs to be understood as a reaction to that kind of argument, which, as I've argued in my book, The Morals of the Market, that they seek to revive an argument, a sort of Montesquieuian argument for the pacifying virtues of commerce, and to treat the market as conducive to social peace, as opposed to as a realm of vicious competition and submerged warfare. I think that, in my view, I don't think that the market is a social contract. I think that the fact that this is a space where individuals, even on Hutt's terms, are completely unaware and indifferent to the idea that they are supposedly contributing, that they are supposedly part of a bigger social process, is actually far more significant than he makes it out to be. So in that sense, I would partially agree with you about the state of nature, but I think, I mean, it would be a second nature rather than a state of nature, in the sense that I think the key aspect of neoliberalism and its critique of laissez-faire, what I was going to talk about in the original paper, is the idea that there's nothing natural about markets, that markets are highly constructed institutions, they're highly regulated, they rely on an appropriate legal order, they rely on the inculcation of a particular form of morality. And in that sense, the market is not natural per se. But certainly, if we think of it as a space where individuals are, in a sense, at war with each other, and if we think of competition as being more akin to war than it is to the activities that a social contract might describe, then yes, certainly we could say that it was a sort of a second state of nature in that sense.
And I'll just say one thing, because I don't want to sort of monopolize the space here, but it could be argued perhaps that what we still call the natural world is becoming more and more artificial itself, and therefore that nature is less and less natural.
Absolutely.
And therefore more and more like the market.
Yes. Yes.
And the two are sort of perhaps meeting in the middle to some extent. Any other questions? In that case, I might be a little cheeky, Jess, and follow on with one more of my only final while we have you here.
Sure.
It's a question about sovereignty. And when we say that the market is sovereign, what do we mean? What sort of sovereignty do we mean? And I'm thinking of, you know, the classic idea of sovereignty as being able to decide on the state of exception. It doesn't appear to me that it's that sort of sovereignty, although it may be that I'm missing something, and you can help us see how it is. I'm thinking of Peter Grattan's book on sovereignty, and the way that he sees it as very much a performance and a staging, as a mise en scène of power. And I'm wondering if it could potentially be a sovereignty in that sort of sense, the representation of the consumer to herself as one who desires. I'm thinking of, you know, advertising here, whether there's something, but the sort of foundation of my question is what sort of sovereignty is market sovereignty?
Yes, thank you. I think that that's clearly a really crucial question. I guess there's the question, what is it for Hutt and that tradition? And then what is it for me, if I would use that term? I mean, I think for Hutt, quite explicitly, it's the locus of ultimate power. And so I think that while that quote I took from Greenspan uses the language of government rather than sovereignty, the idea that market forces rule the world, I think is essentially what Hutt means when he uses sovereignty, and all of those connotations that Ludwig von Mises and Murray Rothbard criticize, that sovereignty is about unitary power, that it's about command, that it's about forcing people potentially through violence to do what you want them to do. All these qualities are qualities that Hutt does want to give to the market and to the consumers at large, that they command, that the producer cannot revolt, cannot resist what the consumers want made, that they must fulfill the commands of the sovereign. Now, if we're talking about how that gives every one of us in our shops the ability to dictate to General Motors or to Shell, that sounds quite nice, maybe. But if we think that the consumers are often the consumers of labour power, i.e. employers, and the producers or the sellers in this sense are those who sell their own labour, then the idea that the consumers are sovereign and that the producer has absolutely no recourse is obviously a much more disturbing kind of an idea. So I think that for them, it's really important that this idea of the sovereignty of the market is sovereignty as ultimate power, as absolute power, as power to impose itself forcibly and demand obedience. I think that that's what is meant by sovereignty in this sense. There's sort of no messing around.
That's really helpful, thank you. In the best tradition of the British pub, I'm going to call final orders now. There's time for one more question if anyone wants to squeeze one in. Lovely. In that case, Jess, we're ever so grateful for your generosity with your time. That such a rich paper and the way you've answered the questions has been really, really enriching. So please join with me, everybody, in thanking Jessica Whyte. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for being here, and thank you for the invitation.